theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, what is going on? We're back with another episode with the one and only Benjamin Studebaker. And today, we're going to do something really fun. And this is something I've been wanting to talk to you about for a long time. So really the idea for this started when, I don't know, 6 months ago, Nance, I did a guest lecture at Philosophy Portal. What up, Cadell? And it was this cool idea Cadell had. He wanted me and Dylan Shaw to have a conversation about Plato and Žižek, and I gave a brief introductory lecture to what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is the section of Žižek's book Event dedicated to Plato. There you go. We each have one of the copies. So, everybody, yeah, it's not two separate books. It's the same book. They just have different publishers and different covers. But no, when I was doing that back then, I was like, man, I want at some point to talk to Benjamin about this, because you are our in-house Platonist. And I'm like, okay, what would Benjamin think of what Slavoj does with Plato here? And you can tell, like, throughout this whole thing, Žižek keeps referring to like textbook Platonism, which we could say maybe more of a classical interpretation of Plato. And so, yeah, what we are doing tonight, everybody, is we're going to get Benjamin Studebaker's thoughts on Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Hegel. I mean, he'll probably be in the mix, but interpretation of Plato. So before we get the show on the road, what is going on, Nance?
I'm just hanging out, man. Yeah, I'm excited to get into this. I've often said my version of philosophy is footnotes to Descartes, Kant, and Hegel. And I know that, philosophy popularly, it's all footnotes to Plato. But no, I do think there's, I don't even know if it's a tension or what, but I think classical antiquities, whatever, I think it's opaque. And there's so many people who go around and act like they get it, and all this Neoplatonism and all this stuff. But I don't think Plato is properly understood or properly applied for the most part. In a lot of political talk, a lot of people on the internet not demonstrate, but perform the expert. But if you actually listen to what they're saying, they have ulterior motives, and they're kind of misapplying Plato and the greats for their political project. And that's just not satisfying. And I've said it before, I don't want to talk about Plato. I don't want to talk about the classics with most people, because I think they're doing that. However, when it comes to who will you talk about this with, Benjamin is right there. So I'm very happy to be here having this conversation.
Hell yeah. Well, Benjamin, welcome back, of course. And yeah, I mean, to get into this, I mean, there's two ways we could start. And I think we'll just go with this for now. All right. Two ways is I could provide a summary of the argument, but I don't want. I'll save it. So, what do you think of this chapter? Well, it's not. It's a subsection of a chapter. So the chapter is chapter 4. Where is it? Here we go. It is on the three events in the history of philosophy, or the three events of philosophy. And real quick, it's just for Žižek, there are three epochal shifts or events in this Baduian sense, right? And it's Plato, and it's Descartes, and it's Hegel. Already, I kind of would want to push back and go, Kant really doesn't get his own event, but no, Slavoj insists it's these three. And in this chapter, he lays out his argument for why he thinks the three of them are, the three main events in the history of philosophy. I do got to give props to Cadell, because in his global brain singularity, he argues there that Plato has a much, much deeper influence on Žižek than people realize. And I think that's true. And I mean, for Žižek to list Plato as one of the three events in the history of philosophy, it shows that even if Plato doesn't have as much, ink spilled on him, compared to Descartes and especially Hegel in Žižek's work, Žižek holds Plato in the highest regard when it comes to his impact on the history of philosophy. So let's start there. What did you think of what you just read?
Yeah, so I read the whole chapter, including the discussion of Descartes and Hegel.
Mhm.
I think that Plato in this chapter gets associated with the idea as objectivity. The idea is objective, it is real. Then Descartes gets associated with subjectivity, cogito is what's real. And then Hegel gets associated with the synthesis of these things. So what is subjective is objective, and what is objective is subjective. I think that would be the quick one-line version of what does it mean to say that the three events are Plato, Descartes, and Hegel.
Okay.
I think that the doxognosis distinction is richer than Žižek portrays it as having been in this chapter. In this chapter, he attributes to Hegel the idea that you can get knowledge through doxa, that it's the mistakes that give you the knowledge. And he applies this in relation to the revolution. It's by failing in the revolution that you reach the point of being able to succeed in it. The proletariat has to try to prevail and fail repeatedly so that it can learn the necessary things to be successful. And this is something which he seems to say is distinctively Hegelian and not there in Plato, because for Žižek, you need subjectivity to get to the point of being able to say this. So you have to pass through Descartes to be able to reach the Hegelian position. And this allows Žižek to tell a progress story. Plato gives you the first part, Descartes the second part, and then Hegel puts them together in such a way that you can use them together. But I think that subjectivity is false, but in a necessary way. In a necessary way in the sense that people who thought in a Cartesian way were able to use philosophy to do various things that people who were in the Platonic tradition could not use it to do. That didn't make subjectivity correct or even necessarily helpful on a purely philosophical level. It was useful, I think, socially, and so became ubiquitous in society because of its usefulness. People who refuse subjectivity don't have aren't pushed to engage in the kind of scientific mechanistic thinking that is important to being able to develop capitalism and industrialism and to do modernity. In an important sense, the Cartesian project is linked with the capacity to do modernity. So there is then this sense that you need to overcome the philosophical limitations of Cartesianism. It's very spiritually limiting. which is why there's such a strong tendency to react to it. But if you simply dump it, then there's this question of whether you'll be able to still think in a scientific way and still be able to carry forward the project of modernity. I think, however, that the synthesis that Žižek proposes is in Hegel is already in Plato without the concept of subjectivity. And the problem with what came before Descartes is not that it was Platonic rather than Cartesian, it was that it was Aristotelian. Something which Žižek points to at the end of the chapter, if we reject Hegel, what do we end up with? Aristotelianism, not Platonism, and not Descartes, but this other thing, which is a kind of regressed Platonism. Generally, when we talk about Aristotelianism as a distinctive thing and not as a contributor to Platonism, it's this regressed, dogmatized, scholastic iteration of ancient philosophy.
And could we translate that just into substance ontology is what we're getting at?
Right. Things having fixed essences, fixed
A equals
natural
A.
essences that don't change. A equals A. Yeah. So gaps, Adornian gaps, I think are already there in Platonism, because in Platonism, you can't simply have gnosis. The point of dialogues like the Theaetetus is to emphasize that attempts to grab onto gnosis and claim that you have it don't go through, because the principle, the one, to come into existence, to come into being, has to become many, so therefore has to contradict itself in coming into being. Beings, however, are the one. They are emanations of it, and the one can only be in and through the beings. So there's both a sense that the beings are less real than the one because they are partial and one-sided, but there's also a sense in which they are the only things that are real because they're the only things that have being. So there's a sense in which the one is beyond being, has a level of reality that is beyond that, but there's also a sense in which the one can only be real in and through being. And these two things go on at the same time in Platonism. It already contains a dialectical thinking of that kind of type. So doxa in Platonism is objective in that when we talk about doxa, these are things that people actually believe, and they believe these things because of their positions. So when Plato is doing like the cycle of regimes in the Republic, he's talking about the demos, which is operating under these opinions, and the oligarchs who are operating under those opinions. And he's able to talk about the opinions that people have as something which is objectively produced and as something which has objective effects, right? It's because the demos doesn't distinguish between the necessary and unnecessary desires, that it's going to struggle to be able to rule the city. And then as a consequence of this lack of understanding, various things will follow on from that. It's a consequence of the oligarchs losing their thrift, that they're going to take the property of these people. So there's a notion that the way somebody perceives things is not simply mistaken or wrong or false, but has effects, and that these effects contribute then to what occurs in ways that can bring about new situations. Now, there's a question about whether doxa can lead to things that are positive or whether it can only lead to degradation. One of the points that he makes is that you can potentially revive a city that has decayed if you can find somebody who is able to make the distinction between the necessary and unnecessary desires and find a way to concretize that distinction again anew. And that's a distinction that is not fixed. In the Republic, there's no list of what are the necessary desires and what are the unnecessary desires. You get only very, very general description at the level of the necessary desires are those most people cannot get rid of, even if they're educated and trained to show restraint. And the necessary desires are those that are good for us, they're beneficial, and we can't get rid of them. Now, in different situations, in different periods, those could be very different in terms of what specific things they would or wouldn't include. There's talk at one point about a story, the Phoenician story, that was told in Phoenicia and that people in Phoenicia believed. And because they believed the story, they were able to sign up to the city in Phoenicia and support it. But if you tell that story to Greeks, they won't believe it. Now, you might think that this means that he thinks Greeks are superior to Phoenicians or inferior to them. But he then says, well, after a couple generations, you could get Greeks to believe it, which means that there's a historical trajectory to Greeks. They are not essentially distinct from Phoenicians in a straightforward way. And then there's also various points across multiple dialogues where he accuses Pericles of having made the Athenians worse. To say that somebody can make the city worse implies that people don't have fixed essences that aren't changeable through social and political interaction. So I think that there is a lot of the stuff that for Žižek is Hegelian, is already Platonic. And I think of the German idealists as people who were trying to revive Platonism, but in modern conditions, and thought it was not possible to revive Platonism by simply rejecting modernity, but that you had to find a way to eminently critique the subject to get back around to Platonism. This concept had arisen. There was a necessity to it. You couldn't get rid of subjectivity through education and training. So it was therefore necessary to meet in some way the demand for subjectivity as a concept in that time period. You couldn't expect people to think without it. So you couldn't simply insist that they get rid of it. And therefore philosophy had to take it up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the concept of subjectivity would always be necessary forever, or that it was a good thing that it became necessary. Nevertheless, it's something you have to transit.
Hey, philosophy in transit. See, mine has a different little subtitle there. So
yes, this one says a philosophical journey through a concept.
So yeah, see, they had to change the subtitle, but it's kind of the same intended meaning. That was great, Benjamin. So I think that gives us a lot to riff off of. I have a direction I want to go in, but Nance, you thoughts before we do that?
I can't say, oh, I agree with you, Benjamin, because I don't. That would be like the pupil agreeing with the master. I feel, but I feel like I'm following, and I feel like I agree. I think the way that I try to leverage the subject in my thinking um, is to point to a void or a gap and say no, this is a no thing rather than a something that can be operationalized or whatever. And I feel like, I mean, the dialectic, the universal and the particular, like the universal can only be instantiated in the particular, and that tension, that contradiction. Um, I like that a lot. I just, for me, so many people have tried to do a Neoplatonism, and I'm always suspicious when it comes to people talking about the one and um, I don't know, mastering the self or mastering the desires is probably a crude way to put it, but also it is true. It's discipline and like that's what we're doing. We are working to climb up something that we can analogize as a ladder or whatever. I think that's all fine and well, and it does fit in with my understanding of subjectivity and this Descartes, Kant, Hegel progression that I think leads to modernity. And I think it is this moment of modernity that we have to reckon with, and we have yet to traverse modernity, and that's why postmodernity, and that's why now everything is like this postmodern version of itself. So if I understand, I feel like that's great, that's excellent, that's awesome. And then I mean then I would go on to say, okay, well, where does psychoanalysis fit into all this? but I think that's probably an unnecessary convolution at this point.
I mean, we could certainly go there. I think that psychoanalysis very much tries to take up the subject and try to walk the subject through uh, the the desert of the subject to the point at which the subject can, in some way, move past or qualify that obsession. There is a kind of attempt to just overcome Cartesianism that psychoanalysis, I think, is engaged in, but it tries to do this eminently. And an immanent critique is more likely to be efficacious if something is indeed necessary. But then there's also the possibility of something that was necessary at one point ceasing to be necessary at another point. And I do think one of the reasons that people find Hegel just very hard to read versus, say, Plato, who is much easier to read, is that subjectivity is, I think, maybe reaching a certain limit in terms of the degree to which people are taken up with it. The kind of materialist turn in a lot of talk in the 2010s, for instance, was this sort of desire to get objective. And I think in the 20th century, there has been this desire to be more objective and talk about, okay, but if we want to get something done, what would we have to do? And this kind of desire for something more objective, I think, is particularly frustrated by postmodernism, which I would describe as kind of hypermodernism, a kind of hyper focus on what it's like to be the subject and turning everything into phenomenology and consciousness studies.
Yeah. I mean, look, here's the thing, right? I think what Slavoj and Lacan, I think one of their main contributions is obviously the theory of subjectivity. I think they make explicit what, human beings have known, forever, which is we have some sense of like our interpolated identity, our symbolically mandated duty. This is, you're a father. You're supposed to X, Y, and Z, right? And human beings, nobody perfectly lives up to this identity that is bestowed upon them. And so there's some sense that all humans have where it's like, what is this dimension of ourselves that won't let us be identical to our identities? And
modernization demands code switching. It demands an ability to constantly change which one of these things that you're in. And I think, by the way, there's a bit where he talks about autism in this chapter.
Mhm.
I think autism is just an inability to code switch in the vast majority of cases. Certainly Asperger's is a limited ability to code switch,
which is to just wear identities as your clothing for the evening, so to speak. And we all know how to do it. Like there is like, oh, we're in a formal setting.
Antiquity,
so
it's not that big a problem to be autistic in antiquity because you're not expected to code switch. You are always the same thing. You have the rectification of names. The name is what you are. You are what the name is. Ancient thinking is much more compatible with being autistic.
And this is where I think the ancients are, they're susceptible to the substantialization of the self, right? Because even though they're aware that people have trouble living up to what's expected of them, like you're saying, and Deleuze and Guattari, they could talk about it in terms of territorializations and all this kind of stuff. But in the ancient world, our identities were not nearly as plastic or fluid as they are now because of capitalism. And I think because we do have to code switch, it does raise this problem more at an explicit level. What endures? What remains the same, or what underlies these different identities? And of course, for Lacan and Žižek, it's this negative thing. Now, Lacan will never give the credit where credit is due for this, but it's really Sartre. It's Sartre who argues that consciousness, or the for itself, is annihilating negativity. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. course, what Sartre doesn't do is, he doesn't bring in the unconscious, he rejects it. So, but there is a way of reading Lacan as synthesizing Freud and Sartre on this thing, on subjectivity, as negative but unconscious. And this is this dimension of ourselves that I think every culture has been aware of on some fuzzy implicit level, but it wasn't until Freud and Sartre that it really becomes theoretically intelligible. I mean, it starts with Descartes, and that's why he's in the chapter. Is the cogito? It's what is the cogito? It's this pure void of subjectivity, devoid of all of you're doubting all of your positive characteristics, all your identifying markers, and you're like, okay, I don't know what I am, but I know I'm not those things because I can doubt all that. And so this
it's
negative
epiphatic
subject,
theology applied to the self as opposed to God.
Yeah.
there you go. Yeah. So okay, so subjectivity's in the mix. I think you're right to point out, like, humans have been aware of this. Like, I have no issue with somebody saying Plato was tapped into this. Was he tapped into it at the explicit level of, say, like Žižek and Lacan? Well,
Yeah, it's different.
It's different.
And maybe not necessarily, I'm not sure that there's a progress here at the level of philosophy. There is progress at the level of society. Subjectivity and Cartesian thinking produced an enormous amount of social and technological and economic progress, which is why we have it and why it will be very difficult to get rid of it. But I think philosophically, the doxonosis schema, if you cash it out, is better than the subject-object distinction. I think it is more helpful for thinking about how things really are, but not in a way which is going to be tested in terms of use. And so that's why I think Plato is a better philosopher, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it in a specific situation. And this is why there's always a need to add something to Plato. Because if you want to cash Platonism out in a specific situation, you end up having to say specific things that Plato's not going to say, because Plato's trying to say something that can be applied in lots of different situations, right? He's trying to get to the abstract idea, and then the invitation to you is to conceptualize it, right? Like even the concept that's in your head of a Platonic idea is the Platonic idea as it appears in the head of a particular being. So the concept as it appears in your head is not identical to the thing, which means you can't have the form in your head. You can have your imitation of the form in your head, which is why in my book I make a distinction between abstractions and conceptualizations of abstractions. As soon as you actually try to make an abstraction do anything, you have a conceptualization of it first before you can cash it out, the version of it that's in your head. And then even specific words like freedom or the good, even those abstractions are specific words. So there is already a sense when we use a name that we have made plural that which is singular, right? But like to say it is and then use a word is immediately to move away from it. Any word, any sound, anything, a picture, anything that I could use to try to gesture, it's already moving away. And so that gap is right there at the very beginning with Platonism.
Okay.
That sounds an awful lot like the chain of signification, and how we're always dancing around the thing. We can never get to the thing or the one or whatever it is.
And there's not a signifier that perfectly names it.
Yeah. To me, I always go like, oh, that sounds just like Kant. That sounds just like Lacan.
Yeah.
That's like,
but if you stay there, right, you won't be motivated to do very much, because you have to take the language seriously to be adequately motivated to operationalize it, right? If you don't conceptualize the abstract, then you can't be motivated to operationalize the conceptualization. So you have to conceptualize to be able to operationalize. And that means you have to move away from truth to be able to make things and do things. which means very often stuff that is effective involves lying in Platonism. Right? So you have noble lies. You have the lie that leads to the good. That's there. It's already there in Platonism.
Want to take an answer?
It really does feel like, and just to be extremely low resolution, that like this hits on the difference between philosophy and theory. And I think going with Kant and Hegel, or Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, it does seem like they're trying to do something. They're trying to make something happen. And I do think that's the case. I think it was this radical break with history. I think modernity broke the world, or capital broke the world. Capital is modernity. And there's been an awful lot of people trying to maybe not put it back together, but find a way to kind of persist in this broken world, this new world. But then again, it does seem to point back to philosophy. It does seem to point back to, oh yeah, Plato makes this distinction between what I'll say, the thing in itself, and then our kind of apperception of the thing in itself. So the noumenal and the phenomenal is already in Plato, it seems.
Our perception is the doxa, thing in itself is gnosis.
Right.
Yeah.
But the difference would be, and this is the Kantian, Copernican revolution, even if that distinction's there in Plato, the transcendental activity of the mind is what Kant famously brings to the table, which is the mind itself is imposing structures on raw sense data. It is active. It is fundamentally participating in the constitution of experience. And so that is this synthetic a priori thing that Kant discovers. Would you say it's Kant, or are you going to say it's there in Plato?
So what I would say is that in Platonism, yeah, everything affects how everything is perceived, because everything is from the one. So yes, that's there, but it's not there at the sense of a kind of dualistic subject-object distinction. So if you have a subject-object distinction, there is this terrible disturbance that occurs, because the way in which you conceive things will always already be affected by the side of this that you are on.
This is also, Heidegger makes the same point. Heidegger was big on that.
Right. It seems to be a problem. But in Platonism, the problem is just that the whole thing itself has split. So the issue is with the split that is in the totality, rather than a specific issue in terms of subject-object.
Okay, so here's where I want to go with it. So I do want to talk about what some of Slavoj's interpretations of Plato. Is it fair to say, well, Žižek's Plato is really more Žižek? I think that's a fair criticism that I think more of a classical Platonist like yourself could make. But it also, I think, brings out, I think there's certain things that he does bring out that are there in Plato, but he's emphasizing them in a unique way. And so, look, early on, what he's going to do is he's going to connect the idea of capital I idea, or the form. He's going to connect the Platonic idea form to the event, and he's going to connect the idea / event to the Hegelian absolute. And so this is this series of, I don't know if I want to make them full-on identifications, but they're certainly strong associations. And so what he wants to emphasize is how an encounter with an idea, and to make it a little bit more concrete for him, like the idea par excellence would be love. Like when you encounter love, it ruptures your life, it destabilizes your life. Nothing matters to you, really. Even if you go along with your prescribed duties, you're doing them in a robotic way. You're going through the motions, because what truly matters is this thing that has erupted into your life and ruptured the status quo. And I mean, that's how Badiou talks about the event. It's this break with the status quo of society, something new, some new truth emerges, and it forever modifies the society. For Badiou, of course, there's the event of love, the political event, the scientific event, and what's the politics? Wait, politics, science, love. How am I missing the fourth event? Hold on, I've got it. Yeah, art. Duh. Okay, so art, politics, art, science, love. And what's unique about Žižek is contra Badiou, he's going to say no. There's philosophical events as well, as we've already said. Plato, Descartes, Hegel. I would argue there's more, but we'll go with what he says here. So the event is this encounter, at least from the position of the subject, and I know we're considering this an issue, subject object, but for him, what happens in the event is that the subject has the status quo of their life ruptured, uh, and love is this great example. But it doesn't have to just be love for Slavoj participating in a political revolution where the idea, and whether it's singular or whether it's plural, I mean, we could get into that if we want, but like, equality, freedom, justice, he calls that an idea. It's one, maybe the idea of the French Revolution, but whether we
You could
want to
do
break
that.
it
You could say all
down.
those abstractions are the one. I'm cool with that.
Okay.
That works.
Because I'm like, because you could just say, well, that's the idea of goodness. I mean, maybe that's a
Yeah.
specific take on it. But yeah, and he describes how when Socrates is in deep philosophical contemplation, he has these moments where it's like, it's hysterical seizure. You kind of, so what do you think of this idea of the ideas being events like this, things that if you encounter them, they rupture the status quo. You're never quite the same. It modifies your relationship to the banal arrangements of your life. Let's start with that.
Yes. So Zizek's account of love in Platonism captures part of it, but not all of it, because there's also the lover, who is one who loves as part of what they do. And the philosopher has, Philo, with respect to Sophia, it's the one whose whole life is the love of philosophy, the love of wisdom. So there's also love as a kind of way of life or form of life. There's the event of falling in love, but then also the form of life, which, maybe in the more contemporary discussion would be described as fidelity to the event.
I think
right?
perfect.
Yeah. So love in Platonism would be not just an event, but also fidelity to that. And also over the course of it, there would be change, because in the course of loving wisdom, you will be changed by the love. So, and this also might mean encountering further events. So, I would be inclined to say that what makes an event is that it changes what is necessary versus what is unnecessary in terms of desires, in terms of concepts. So it makes something that wasn't necessary before necessary, or it makes something that was necessary before unnecessary. And I think that there's a lot of things that are described as events that don't really fundamentally affect any of that, like the Tahrir Square thing that gets brought up in this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really prove to be an event in that sense. Didn't change what concepts people had to use. Didn't change, didn't cause people to discard a bunch of old concepts. Indeed, what do we have in Egypt now? It's another military dictator. So the fact that people go out and do something in and of itself doesn't mean that you have an event in terms of an alteration to the necessary, unnecessary distinction at the level of desires or at the level of conceptualizations or abstractions. Like, for me, an event would be, okay, you used to be able to talk in terms of God and nature. And now you can't do that anymore. When you use those words, they don't have the effect that they previously had. You can keep using them, but it won't matter in the way that it did. And that's something that is not something that occurs all at once, but it can seem to have occurred all at once if you weren't aware of this while it was going on. And all of a sudden you make the invocation of, come on, it's a violation of God's will to betray your sovereign. And people go, we're not really persuaded by that. And you haven't noticed that that has lost its force. So this smacks you as an event. And yet, you could nonetheless, if you were paying attention, maybe have seen some of that coming. You wouldn't necessarily have been able to see when it would become socially important. You wouldn't necessarily be able to go, this is an objective revolutionary situation, but you might have been able to go, it seems like these concepts are waning or losing their force. People aren't using them with the same spirit. They get invoked, but there's an ironic detachment. There are things that you might have been able to notice. But an event is something that hits somebody who didn't notice these things, missed these things insofar as they were there to be seen. And then once the event occurs, now you have to recognize that different concepts must be used, different desires have to be met. The Soviet Union, just faced an event that you could not treat the luxury goods that were commonly available in North America as unnecessary desires. You couldn't say that people who wanted blue jeans and rock music were being unreasonable bourgeois people. You had to recognize that this was now a necessity, and if you don't provide these luxury goods, you will not have a legitimate regime. People will not tolerate a regime that doesn't permit these things. At the same time, in Iran, before the Iranian Revolution, people might have thought that the blue jeans and the rock music were necessary, but then all of a sudden it was discovered that you could run a regime without those things, at least for some period of time. So that would be where I would kind of be inclined to think about the event in terms of what concepts do you have to use to be able to actually accomplish things? What concepts are you no longer having to use, or now you can't use at all? In fact, you'll get in trouble if you use them. They'll cause problems for you. And then also at the level of desires, what desires do you now have to meet? What desires do you no longer have to meet? Or would it even be a problem for you to meet? If you tried to meet them, people would think that you were doing something wrong. That for me would be an event. And so then when we talk about, say, a philosophical event, I think part of the reason people like Badiou might be reluctant to treat philosophical events as events is that there's a question about, where does Plato come from? Why does Plato have this thought? Like a journal like Historical Materialism would be inclined to try to situate Plato having that thought in the context of Athens and to say, what is it in Athens that happened that gave rise to that? And they would probably identify it with the change in the regimes in the Greek cities, the rapid political change, which gives rise to change as a thing. Change happens. So you can't simply have a naturalistic metaphysics. In a context where there's a lot of change, it becomes very difficult to just claim that there's one particular natural order. And if you want to renaturalize things, you're going to have to do some work.
Okay, so I think that's a very helpful explanation of how you understand event. How do you feel like idea or form? Do you make this association, or do you see there being this type of evental status of an encounter, or I don't know, the approaching of an idea? Is getting tapped into a Platonic idea something that can rupture your life, be evental? Do you see that connection?
So I think the different loves in the Republic, everybody is a lover of either the good, status, or pleasure. Now, there's a possibility of changing what you love or changing what kind of soul you have. So even though it's talked about as different kinds of souls, there is in the Phaedrus, for instance, a bit where Socrates prays not to have too much money, because if he acquires too much money, then this will change who he is. So there's an implication that the kind of soul you have can be changed, even though there's also stories about the souls coming down from the heavens and being born into people. And because there's both of those kinds of things, you can try to construct a very naturalistic model of souls out of this. But also there's resources in the text to resist this, particularly the cycle of regimes and the ways in which there are changes in the character of the people in the city over time. But I would be inclined to say that a lot of people have a love that they wouldn't necessarily have encountered as an event, but is a habit. And then sometimes those habits get disrupted or broken up, and there's a change in what you love. And that would be an event. But love isn't always an event. Sometimes love is something you're in the habit of doing. You're in the habit of being in relation, and then something happens which breaks this or shatters it or reconfigures it or opens up some new object that previously you didn't see or you didn't notice or you didn't look at it like that. That would be what I would be inclined to say. And I think part of the reason that love seems like an event in modernity is that there are a lot of people who don't see themselves as lovers of anything because of the cogito. The subject makes you go, well, who am I? What am I? And it's in part because you're code switching all the time in modernity. And because you're always code switching, you are constantly wearing hats and putting on masks, and you never actually get to be somebody that you straightforwardly view as you. You're not embedded at any point simply in a role. So there's the rapid code switching in modernity gives rise to a question of, do I actually care about any of this? Do I love any of it? And then to be able to say, aha, this is what I love, this would be an event. And this is why Heidegger describes, people as just choosing something to love out of all of the various things they're pressed into in modernity to wear as hats or faces. But in Platonism, love would be there from the start. The idea that you would not have love or that you would have to choose from outside, from the position of cogito, what it is that you love, that would not make sense. You would be in the habit of loving certain things, and then those habits would be broken up or changed, often by the legislator, right? Who makes the habits in Aristotle? It's the legislator who constructs the habits. And if there's a change in the city, if there's a change in the political form of the city, then there will be a change in the habits that the city inculcates. And then that will result also in changes in what people love. But this is something which happens, which involves both the doxa and the objective things. It's not something which is the cogito stepping it back into itself and going, oh, but who am I in all of these roles that I'm playing? Which one do I choose to identify with? Which one am I going to irrationally commit to? That wouldn't be in Platonism. And I think it's a nice thing about Platonism that you don't have to think about it like that.
Well, yeah, and so because there's different types of love, I mean, I think about C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves, and obviously that comes out of Christianity, and a lot of Christianity comes out of Plato, right? Okay. Maybe an added layer to this is to say, no, the way Slavoj describes love as an event is right, but there's also love as status quo. And that's where this friction within love comes into play, because there's different modes of love. The evental type of falling in love that ruptures your field of love. But you can say it just like that. His description of it is, you meet somebody new, you fall passionately in love, and you start going through these like mechanical motions when it comes to your children that you already have, when it comes to your friends and all of that. But the point is, all of that exists within a field of love. Your kids, your friends, right? So it's really the status quo of love being disrupted by a love event.
But it's also often related to death drive, right? Because oftentimes the French person who has the affair goes, I have been dead until this moment when I have, been awakened by the love of the young woman, right? There's a sort of feeling in modernity that the things that you would love, you aren't able to love, because the way in which they're structured in modernity and the amount of code switching you have to do kills or prevents you from feeling love in these things and reduces them ultimately to pragmatism. And so then there's a craving of newness to fill in this gap, needing a new experience that you can love initially until it also degrades into a pragmatic. So I think that there's accuracy to what Žižek is saying, but it's specifically a modern, something which comes out of the process of modernization. And then part of what we're trying to do in the process of modernization is to overcome it. So in talking about Platonism, I'm also kind of talking about what it would mean for the process of modernization to fully overcome itself.
Well, also, I mean, look, this idea that we have of, oh, we need a revolution in society, or we need a structural uh, reconstitution of society. Isn't this basically us applying our concept of like negative subjectivity to society itself, where it's like, aha, society is not its positive, its identifiers, its current structures. There's a negativity here that we can undo the structure of the symbolic order and make a new symbolic order. Badu calls it new symbolization. This is a possibility. It seems to underlie or rest upon the very evental self that Slavoj attributes to Descartes. Whereas older societies, if you went back 1,000 years ago and said, "Hey, we want to completely restructure your social order," they would just go, "Well, that kills it. It doesn't endure."
Monty Python.
Well, in Platonism, there is an account of why you would restructure the social order, right?
Really? Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah, because in Platonism, there is the argument that you have to go through the course of regimes to get to a point where it's possible to refound the city. So Plato goes, according to the famous story in the seventh letter, to Syracuse to meet with the tyrant, to try to get the tyrant to transform the city. And this is something which doesn't ultimately work. But there's an idea here that you go to the tyrant, you go to the worst person, the person who is ranked at the bottom in terms of happiness and in terms of the quality of his soul in all of the Platonic texts. And you go and intervene in that context, the context where you have the absolute worst kind of city. You don't go to Sparta on the basis that Sparta is at an earlier stage of decay than Athens because it's not yet a democracy. You go to the absolute most despicable city, the city which gave us the word tyrant. And that's where you try to make the intervention. And when he fails to make the intervention in Syracuse, according to the story, and we don't know if the seventh letter is authentically by Plato, but regardless of whether it's by him, it might contain accurate biographical details about his life. He returns to Syracuse multiple times, which implies that not only does he think that the tyranny is the place where you potentially would make the transformation, but he is adequately convinced that you can't do it somewhere else, that even after he fails in Syracuse, he thinks nonetheless that he has to come back. And the failures in Syracuse are, according to the story, dangerous for him. He gets enslaved. His life is in danger. People have to buy his freedom. Terrible things happen to him. Now, a lot of people look at this and laugh at him and go, ha ha, silly Plato, thinking that you could do this through, making an appeal to elites in a tyranny. But a lot of people nowadays have a conception of tyranny, like the total society is a kind of tyranny in the sense that, for Plato in a tyranny, nobody is ruling because the tyrant doesn't have the capacity to rule his own soul, let alone the city. The tyrant's soul has not been positioned for that. In democracy and in, the later stages of oligarchy, people can't distinguish between the necessary and unnecessary desires. So they can't rule on the basis of an understanding of that distinction. So people don't rule in the later stage Platonic cities. Nobody's able to rule. And in that respect, what you have looks more like the total society of, Adornian critical theory than it does, these images of bourgeois democracy where there's a demos that's able to rule through representatives. There's a nation that exists that can have a representative government that operates on the basis of its will. The story that Plato tells about these Greek cities and how you overcome the condition in them is more similar to the quest for a way out of the total society that comes in much later work, after Hegel. So my impulse would be to say in Platonism, you could certainly find a lot of resources for thinking about a transformation which is intended to make things better rather than worse. That's not to say that you have a straightforward blueprint for doing it, but you also don't get that from Adorno, and people are willing to treat Adorno as a complex and interesting thinker who treats these things in a sophisticated way. That would be my basic thought there.
Okay. I mean, look, I go back. I mean, I still am kind of curious. So the way that he describes this kind of like existential epiphany of an encounter with an event that he calls like Socrates's, it's this hysterical seizure. It's almost madness. I mean, to you as a Platonist, do those images of Socrates resonate with you as far as how you go about, you know, living the Platonic life, or because Zizek's big on these moments, and I'm wondering if you're big on this type of thing, or if you're like, yeah, this is not really part of it at some essential level.
And there is a point of kind of deciding that the good is something that you care about in itself and that it doesn't have to be cashed out in instrumental things. It takes a while to work through that if you're young. At one point in the Republic, Plato says that you have to be 30 before you can really even properly be trained in dialectic. So there's a point at which it's not really fully possible to enter into love of the good in itself. Somebody can try to copy that, but copying the behavior is the same from really having it. And like a lot of Buddhist monasteries where you talk about enlightenment, there's a lot of people who are trying to have enlightenment and who are trying to act like they have it. But there's a difference between going through the motions and following the habit and actually having it. Nonetheless, lots of Buddhists maintain that the way to get it is to go through the motions and pretend until all of a sudden you do.
It's also the Pascal thing.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, so I do think for me, there was a point at which I decided I was going to be a Platonist. And then there was still some working out of what that meant over time. It wasn't all at once that it was worked out. And I had to kind of change habits in my brain. I had to decide there were certain habits I didn't want to be in anymore, that I was going to gradually destroy. And I would do this by just intervening in my cognitive process when these ways of thinking would come up and just gently, without getting mad at myself, kindly shepherd myself away from that style of thinking. It's how I have been fighting the war in my head against blaming and shaming people, for instance, or putting people in baskets of deplorables. It's a gradual intervention process, which takes time and doesn't happen all at once. And also, it's never complete. So you don't simply get to the end. And this is a difference I have with like some Buddhists think that you just get enlightened and then you're always enlightened. You know, there's a kind of continuous. It depends on how well structured your life is, and Platonism gets this. The subject, that whether your doxa is close to gnosis depends on whether you're in a city that permits this, whether you have a form of life that permits it. So to be a lover is not just the event, it's also to create a form of life that makes it possible to be in fidelity to that event and which allows the event to be developed. So that the event is not complete in its first moment. It has to be developed and instantiated. And it has to be instantiated in a sufficiently open way that it doesn't ossify into a dogma and become the negation of itself. So you also have to maintain a constant critical attitude to your attempt to instantiate it, and to constantly be open to the possibility that the way you've structured it is wrong. And I have these moments all the time where I think that the way I've structured various parts of my life is terribly wrong. But that's part of thinking through it. And when I think through it, I don't recriminate myself because it was an attempt. Each thing in my life is an attempt to do it. So it's not like mistakes are necessary and inevitable as being a being with the body. That's all in the theory already accounted for in that sense. You're going to screw up in Platonism. But you'll have these moments where you feel like you're doing really well. Like Plotinus, for instance, will tell this story about these moments he had that were really great, where he felt like he returned to the one. But even he won't claim to have been, permanently with the one. He'll say, I had this number of moments with the one. And then other Neoplatonists will like try to compare how many moments they had, and they'll rank themselves based on how many. And then they'll question, well, but did he really have them? Yeah, but of course, these are moments where you feel, in terms of your opinion, like there was a closeness, but you can't actually grab. And some later Neoplatonists get a little grabby because of the influence of Stoicism and all that other stuff.
So what I like about what you just said, though, this is interesting for people who are interested in Lacan and Zizek, because even though I'm bringing a different term here, and it's a term that's loaded and people don't like it, and but I think the way you're describing this is helpful. So what you're trying to do and the way you're living in accordance with the good, it really is what it's like to try to live up to a master signifier. And people don't like this term because master is bad and signifier seems lifeless or something. But what it actually means is organizing principle, right? It's this signifier upon which all the other signifiers are organized. Again, it sounds abstract, but what you're describing is trying to live in accordance with a certain organizing principle. Let's put it like that. And to try to navigate that is exploratory. It is something that trial and error, uh, but it structures your whole life. And so, this brings us to, Socrates is this image of hysterically challenging master signifiers or fundamental presuppositions or fundamental presuppositional organizing principles, right? Um, and so this gets to another dimension of it, right? Where when we think about Plato, we think of him as, you know, the positive dimension of the philosophy is, trying to inspire people to live in accordance with the good or the forms, right? But there's also this Socratic aspect of Plato's philosophy, which is undermining the forms, undermining and
the conceptualizations.
Okay, so that's
undermine
what
the conceptualizations, right? As soon as somebody says, I know what justice is, my conceptualization of justice is just true. You have to undermine that. Their particular idea of justice that's in their head can't possibly be it, is always not identical to it, right?
Okay.
There's never a rejection of justice in Plato, but there is a rejection of every specific conceptualization of justice that's offered. And then people will read that if they're skeptics and go, aha, he doesn't want you to believe that there is such a thing as justice. No, he wants you to be aware that when you conceptualize justice to use it, you're wrong. However, in being wrong, you might be able to accomplish something, but remember that you're wrong. And later, in a new situation, bear in mind that wrongness will eventually get you. So reopen it later when you get a chance and let it become something else.
I like that. But here's this interesting Hegelian Žižekian twist, right? So the next move would be to say, well, actually, the forms don't really exist. What you have is a bunch of particulars fighting to be the instantiation of this empty form. And so what we really have are concrete universals or particular universals where you have different movements claiming to be the movement of freedom, justice, etc. So they're all trying to fight over the same form, the same ideas, and yet they are drastically different in how they actualize in a particularistic way these forms. So, for example, capitalism wants to say it champions freedom. Communism, even though it doesn't want to do bourgeois liberal freedom, there's communists that would argue communism is true freedom, right? Well, okay, so freedom good in both cases, how it's actualized or made concrete is drastically different. And so this brings us to the big question. And I think Slavoj gets at it. You as a Platonist are obviously constantly thinking it, which is the ontological or metaphysical status of ideas themselves. Trying to think, well, okay, there's a way that it's always said of Plato that the forms exist in some transcendent realm. Žižek accuses textbook Plato of substantializing the forms, or we could say reifying the forms. Like in some other dimension, there's some pure shining beacon of goodness or one of freedom or what. and then you get to the lower, there's a form of chair, there's a form of tree. Where are you at with all this? I mean, how do you consider the status of ideas?
Yeah. So there are lots of stories in Platonism that involve some other space, some other world. It's not a space. That's the first thing to bear in mind about it. And each time one of these stories is introduced, either it's prefaced with, nobody's ever going to believe this. It would be very difficult to believe this. Even we can't believe it. Or it's prefaced with, bear in mind, this is just a story that it might be useful if people believed. And also, if it's a story that it might be useful if people believed, it's also useful if the people who tell it believe it. Because if they believe it, they'll be better at telling it. So there are many moments in Platonism where there's explicit attention drawn to the potential usefulness of a story. And this includes all sorts of metaphysical stories. The Timaeus is the capital city of metaphysical stories. That's the dialogue that is the great hub of metaphysical stories in Plato, though you can find these kinds of stories in other dialogues as well. The way that I look at these things is that in a certain kind of context, it would be helpful to tell these kinds of stories because people would believe them. And if they believed them, it would make it easier for them to make the distinction between necessary and unnecessary, especially the people who are not that philosophical, who would struggle to reach it through dialectic, would struggle to enter into dialectic. One of the functions of Platonic dialogues is to illustrate the limits of dialectic for accomplishing things in the world. You can't just have a philosophical conversation and on the basis of this convince everybody to support the kind of city where you think all of these things would be able to best flourish. If you have just a straight conversation, many people will be recalcitrant. They'll say there's no such thing as the good. You're just trying to assert that you're better than everybody else. You're claiming, you're trying to assert your status and you're using the good as a Trojan horse for your status claims. Or you're talking about the good, but it's just because you get off on doing it. This is just a sexual pleasure for you, Socrates, to do this kind of stuff. And the really nasty characters, like Callicles and the Gorgias, they will just accuse Socrates of being an arrogant person who enjoys and gets off on setting himself above others and humiliating other people in discussions. And this is something that happens in real life to me all the time, where I'll be talking about this kind of stuff and someone will say, you can't really believe any of that. You're just using all of that to try to set yourself above somebody else. Like in my Substack piece I wrote recently about baskets of deplorables, one of the easiest responses that someone could make to me is that my claim that there's an alternative to making baskets of deplorables is just another way to set myself above other people and is therefore no different really from the different levels of baskets of deplorables. This
Because the
would be something that
deplorables are those who make baskets of deplorables. Somebody make that move, right?
yeah.
So because you don't do that, you're the non-deplorable.
Right. I'm therefore the better person, and I'm inviting people to, for spiritual reasons, but it's really because this will be the ultimate, way to feel good about your position in modernity and in capitalism will be to think like this. And then you'll be really, really satiated because you'll be able to feel like you're better than everybody. This is often a response to this. And it's a kind of impasse that comes from just meeting somebody who just doesn't love the concept and can't even treat it seriously, can't treat it as something that you might genuinely believe, can only treat it as a device for power relations often. And there's kind of a Foucauldian accusation often that's made in this direction. And there's a limit to what you can really say about it because it's a question of what do you take seriously? What's the appropriate attitude to concepts? And that's something that when you're talking about how should you treat the good, I mean, there's normative content involved in how should you do that. So to me, it seems to kind of imply the good, to ask the question of how should you treat the good or what should your attitude be to it. It would be difficult to give an answer that wouldn't involve something that for me would involve drawing on a principle. But lots of people will maintain that, that there is just no truth about how you ought to do it or how you should treat it. That's just people trying to be in charge or get off. And you can't argue with that. It's a fundamentally different attitude to everything.
Okay, I have a couple places I want to go with it, but Nance, what are you thinking?
I think to go back to discussing the event, retroactivity is kind of key. Yeah, it is key, and the kind of the quilting point, and everything is always retroactive. And for me, again, I'm going to bring that back to Kant, and then Hegel, the silent weaving, and then Zizek and Lacan, and all this, and it does make me wonder if that's in Plato at all, or if that even if it even matters from the Platonic perspective, that there is this retroactivity, um, where the disruption happens long before it you realize it has happened, and it's only when you can look back upon it, so that there can be this kind of habitus that's existing. um and I don't know, and maybe that's a tension between idealism and materialism. And I think, yeah, that's probably why people wouldn't want to say that we have a philosophical event, because they want to be good materialists. um but yeah, I wonder about the retroactivity of it all. I think that's key to Zizek and Hegel, and even Kant in a way. And I don't know if it's in Plato or if it matters.
Mm. Yeah, the idealism materialism split is kind of backdated onto this stuff. You wouldn't find Plato saying, I'm an idealist and not a materialist. He wouldn't
Yep.
have a debate with the atomists in that kind of language. Um, in terms of, I do think one of the things that occurs in modernity is that change happens very fast, faster than it can be processed. And this is noticed by a lot of theorists in early to middle modernity as something new, that change can happen faster than you can process it or deliberate about it. And I think that there's kind of different speeds of change that can happen historically, which affect the degree to which it's true that the owl of Minerva only comes at dusk. So you can have a situation where things change slowly that you don't see any change. Even the change that occurs is slow enough that you don't see any change. And this is the condition in which people naturalize and reify. Then you've got a situation where change is occurring, but you think you can see it before it happens, you can anticipate it. It might not give you a capacity to intervene, but you can see it and maybe talk about it. And one of the things you might discover in talking about it is that talking about it is not the same thing as having a capacity to intervene.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got change that happens faster than you can notice it or talk about it, but you're able to process it after the fact. And then there would be change that happens so fast that you can't even process it after the fact. And it confronts you as something which barbarizes and stupefies you. Which is part of why I think, the kids are really into the hard style remixes of the pop songs. This is, neoliberalism and modernity just bludgeoning you into submission to the point at which you just, everything turns off and it's just slop.
Yep.
But no, but you were saying earlier, right? This retroactive conversion of necessity into contingency and contingency into necessity. That's exactly the kind of thing Slavoj always wants to emphasize with retroactivity.
Mhm.
And of course, he's drawing on not just Hegel, but Freud and Lacan in this. And so, yeah, I think the event as this thing that makes the contingent necessary or the necessary contingent. Would you say that is there in Plato?
Yeah, I would say that there is an account of how things become necessary or unnecessary. It would not just be the event, though, because it would always be also habits and also laws and legislation. So it would not be just the moment where you create the law, but also the process of transformation that occurs as a consequence of that, which can be something which takes a certain amount of time. And sometimes there's talk at the level of generations in Plato of what will happen over the course of one or two generations. And there are sometimes even attempts to get very specific and talk, in terms of numbers. But oftentimes there will be language at the level of generations. Did Pericles make the next generation better? in a couple of generations, could you make people believe something they can't currently believe? After some number of generations, the oligarchs lose their thrift. How many generations does it take for the oligarchs to lose this characteristic? Stuff like that.
A lot of the kind of postmodern people that I'm very wary of try to capitalize on that element of it all, of the cyclical nature of it all, and they'll make appeals to Spengler and Hindu philosophy and stuff like this.
Yeah, they try to grab it and turn it into a very scientific kind of predictive, but this is, to try to make Cartesian something that's not meant to work like that.
So this point where the event, it's something that it's also habitus, and it's also the word I will use for it now is just extant. It's also coming from the legislation. It's coming from the countryside or the city, or on and on and on and on. I think for me, one point of subjectivity that doesn't get a whole lot of love, I think, is the fact that we're socially constituted. So in Plato, can a man be a man void of other men? I think along with the subject object, we also have language, and we also have this kind of Hegelian or Lacanian process of, or I think Levinasian, like, I am me, but I am also Benjamin, and I am also Mikey, and I'm also my children, and like, these are all the things that make me me, and it's the ways in which I fail to live up to them, but it's also the ways in which I carry them with me. Like, everything is constitutive of
the
me
inflection of otherness.
Yeah. That which is other to me is at the core of me in this way. And I feel like that's a modern thing, but I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Does Plato allow for being socially constituted in this way? Or can one man reach communion with the one on his own?
Yeah, so there's definitely civil constitution. At the level of generality, there is some level of notion of exception or of incompleteness to this. So it won't be the case that you'll get a kind of Althusserian story where everyone is completely constituted in a top-down way, in a totalizing sense, with predictable outcomes across the board. It's not scientistic or deterministic to that degree. But you will get differences in terms of what types of souls are ruling and in how common different types of souls are. You will get changes in that at a kind of more general level as you go through the transformation of the city. Aristotle makes a point that outside the city, man is a beast or a god. So there's a supposition here that someone who is not in any way in relation to the city would not be a person. That to be totally out of relation to the city, you would be in a different category. Also, the barbarian is often posited as the uncivilized entity. And of course, in Aristotle's language, the barbarian is uncivilized, therefore the barbarian is a beast or a god, but certainly not a person. Now, I think there's a case to be made that there's an underestimation of the sociality of barbarians and of the kinds of structures that they have, especially in Aristotle. But there is this, I think, a notion that you can't really be a person unless you are in relation. And therefore, there wouldn't be a notion of a subject which is divorced from the object. And this is not merely a claim at the level of nature, it's a claim at the level of the city. So it's a politically and social, it's a political and social claim.
So, okay, there's a couple directions I want to go in. Before you do that,
just real quick,
so
before I forget,
okay,
the Stoics would say nature and not the city or the social. The Stoics criticize Plato and Aristotle for saying that you need the city or the social to be virtuous.
Okay, so Žižek wants to make this, if it's not a full-on identification, this incredibly strong association between idea and event. Is that the move you don't want to go for? Is that where is this maybe the fundamental difference where you might say an event can be tapped in to an idea, but an idea is broader than an event?
Yeah. So there's also a question here about when we talk about idea, are we talking about conceptualization, abstraction, or do we want to even make the point of not something that is named?
Maybe hold
Because a
on.
lot of the
Let me
time
see
when
if I can
people,
find an actual
yeah,
example from him to read here.
like he talks about freedom in Tahrir Square, but it's also possible that when he's talking about freedom, he's talking about the conceptualization of freedom affirmed by the Egyptians in the square, freedom as an abstraction, or freedom as an imperfect name for the idea.
Yeah, I'm looking for. Okay, so now this is going back to that example, but I want to focus more on just what he's using the example to say, not whether or not it's a good example.
Hmm.
So what he says is, this is on in my copy at least, on page 84. He says something happened that few predicted, violating the experts' opinions, as if the uprising was not simply the result of social causes, but of the intervention of a foreign agency into history, the agency that we can call, in a Platonic way, the eternal idea of freedom, justice, and dignity. Such miraculous events can also take the form of a momentary personal experience. And he goes on to give this example of these two Jewish kids who were forced to suffer horrifically at the hands of the Nazis. And as they're being killed, they hold each other's hand. And for him, the hands grasp in each other in love and solidarity is this moment where the Platonic good, or the Platonic idea of freedom, justice, however we want to describe it, of love, shines through. And it is this empirical yet fleeting instantiation of the good. And for him, this kind of verb like dimension of the idea, the evental dimension of the idea, that's really what the idea is for him. And he doesn't seem to be interested in like anything transcendent or substantial. Like for him, it's almost he does his own inversion of Plato, kind of like Deleuze does his inversion of Plato, but Zizek's inversion is concrete material reality as we know it. That's the stable, fixed, substantial thing. The idea or the absolute, because he's going to connect the two, that's what's fleeting. That's what's fragile. That's what only can peek out for a second and it's almost gone before you can grasp it. It is this inversion of like, no, the Platonic idea is not the substantial grounded ground. It is the thing that's so fragile and so fleeting in our experience, but it's what shines through in these very impactful, significant moments. And I guess for him, he would say that there's a way to attune ourselves more to it, or to be ready for it, opposed to being closed off to it. And yeah, I think I mean, the main thing he would want to say, I think, as far as the status of ideas go, is just this inversion that um, this are ideas the only true substantial reality, or are ideas fleeting, illusory appearances of eternality? Slavoj will say that it is the latter that are the true ideas, the fragile absolute. Thoughts?
That's how it looks in a heavily alienated condition.
Hmm.
So there is truth in that that is how it looks, but it's a consequence of the heavily alienated condition where we're very alienated from the good and we're very alienated from love. And so these things only appear in fleeting and ephemeral ways.
Real quick, does capitalism blind us to the good?
Yeah, capitalism and modernity are processes of alienation. Yeah.
Mhm.
And you have to go through a process of alienation to get out from under. But there's, the process of alienation implies that there is something underneath that that is continuing. It's just that you're very alienated from it. And the thing that you're alienated from takes the substantial form of your mode of life, but in a way that deeply alienates you from that thing. So there's a sense in which, even though our form of life is very alienated from the good, our form of life is also an instantiation of it, because everything is an instantiation of the one. Nothing can be a negation of it unless you move into some kind of Gnostic position. And I'm not a Gnostic. So it can't be said that everything that has being is opposed to idea, and idea shows up, flickers for a moment, is fragile. Rather, idea is, the one is even the very bad being, is even the very incomplete, very alienated being. That's
So it's
still
all on
it.
a continuum.
Right. And you have to go through the alienation to get the thing back in a way that you could never have had it before. Right. In antiquity, the set of people who could potentially access the one and live the good life was very restricted to the people who own the slaves. And you have to go through the period of alienation, the process of modernization, the process of capitalism, to get to a stage where it's possible for the good to be participated in a less mediated way by a larger part of the population. To get to that, you have to create a form of life which is heavily, heavily alienating. Like in Vico's The New Science, there's this idea that you somehow sustain this Cartesian rational position that's unpoetic and devoid of love for a long period of time by scientific means. And that this allows you to get all of these benefits that come from this kind of mode for a very, very long time, and put off and delay the negative symptoms that arise out of it, or to prevent those negative symptoms from consuming it. There's an idea in Plato that if you step too far away from the good, you're going to have difficulty sustaining the thing that you make. And it's going to therefore want to collapse back into the good. So if you go farther and farther away, to democracy, to tyranny, it's going to want to come back around, because you're going to make something that becomes quite difficult to sustain. Politics and morality are not opposed in Platonism or in ancient thought, because the assumption is that if you betray morality, you will also betray politics. If you do bad things, you will have something that cannot last. Modernity is a kind of sorcery which allows something that is heavily alienated and very bad to last for a long time. But even though it's a kind of sorcery in that sense, it's not the negation of the good. It is the prolongation of a heavily alienated bad condition, so that you can get the things that can only be obtained through alienation and badness, which is luxuries, growth, prosperity, commodious living, enormous capacity and power, all the things that people pursue in the alienated condition, that if they were being philosophers, they wouldn't be so interested in. Which is why I say, if you want to do things and if you want to make things, you have to step away from philosophy. But you can do it in the service of philosophy if you maintain the memory of what you're trying to do as you do it. And the problem is that as you make people, and more generations of people, they have a hard time remembering what the point of it all is. And that's what we're doing now. We're forgetting what modernization and capitalism are for, because they've been going on for too long, which was a danger right from the start, that they would go on for so long that people would forget about what they're for. And then you would need these little reminders. And Žižek is trying to draw attention to those reminders, but I think there's a little bit of a risk in the way that he's putting it, that people might get Gnostic and think that being is this bad thing that has to be saved in some way by the idea. The being is, and I think you would agree with this perhaps if we were talking about it together, it's an alienated condition which has to self-overcome. And that's why he defends the subjectivity event and the Cartesian event as something you still have to be in fidelity to, and criticizes in another one of the chapters in this book the Buddhists for, like the scientists, trying to not deal with the subject, because he still thinks it's necessary to go through the subject. You can't not go through it. This is still for him something that you have to do to be able to move through this period. And it would be a kind of ultra left position to say that you don't have to.
Okay.
Which is why I'm always at the risk of being ultra left. The best criticism of me is that I might sometimes be ultra left.
We'll forgive you.
Yeah.
But no. So Nance, you got anything? I've got like 4 different things I want to think through real quick.
I know for me, hearing that, and maybe it's because I am so so deeply to my core a 21st century digital boy. I keep finding myself wanting to I want to do. I I I I may perform this thing where I can say I love to think. I love philosophy. I love Sophia. Um but when it comes right down to it, I don't, because I say no. We are the creatures who alienate. We are like abstraction is alienation, and like isn't the act of thinking itself engaging in this alienation and all these things, and I can't help but see um the one as a cessation of this thing that I call being, that much as I've struggled and suffered and um, all the evils and ills of the world and everything, and I'm a pessimist and I'm a nihilist and I am this, I'm a depressive and all these things. But if you ask me, would I prefer cessation or would I prefer um, to continue in my alienated state, and in fact deep in my alienation, I think I would prefer this alienated state, I think.
And that's why the philosopher goes back into the cave. The philosopher still has a use, and that use is overcoming use. The philosopher comes into the cave to rescue people from use. The philosopher loves everything too much and everybody too much to not do that. So there's a certain failure of philosophy in terms of failure of the love. And this is a point like Mahayana Buddhists make against Theravada Buddhists, for instance, right? There's a failure of the love if you don't go back in. And if you say, well, I'm just going to protect my peace and protect my state of mind and keep my very good monastic habits so that I'm able to be at all points in the best possible condition. If you do this, you won't actually do what the love should properly drive you to do. And that is itself a kind of confusion. The philosopher is not someone who simply withdraws. The philosopher is someone who, out of love for wisdom, helps people to overcome their being trapped in use. So helps beings to overcome being, and has to do that in and through being. And so steps away in the service of the thing. And that's why I think ultimately the philosopher is the one who is there to overcome labor, for whom that's the purpose. The purpose is the overcoming of labor and not something else.
And I mean that, yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, so I guess where the main place I want to go with it right now is, we kind of already said this, but I want to just highlight it and maybe say a bit more. So, all right, I'm gonna accept that what I'm gonna say are, it's assertions. I'm not arguing for them, but because I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. I don't feel like I have to. So, but I'm gonna recognize the kind of presuppositional status of this. Right? If we accept that capitalism says there's no greater value than commodity value, or the ultimate value within commodity value, which is capital accumulation. That's the highest, most important value, and all other values must bend to that. We know that in our world, how's it going to affect the economy? Like, this is always the final justification or the final argument against, is the economy. This idea that there's no higher value than economic value, this is where Plato would be an anti-capitalist, correct?
Yeah. So I think that Platonism would recognize, that processes of alienation are kind of inevitable, and they're bad, but also you do have to go through them. Uh, and to try to avoid going through them wouldn't work. So I wouldn't frame Plato as simply an anti-capitalist in the sense of oppositional or just negating. Certainly, he didn't know what capitalism was. He didn't live in a context with capitalism. But I would try to infer this from the way he talks about commerce and money. So, for instance, the financier or the household manager is the third type of soul in the nine in the Phaedrus. Is considered somebody who can be relatively pretty good, but not as good as the philosopher who's interested in the thing in itself. So there is a sense in which you can be someone who tries to pursue money, but if you're pursuing money, it shouldn't be for the sake of money, but for the good of the household or enterprise on behalf of which you're serving. So I think that there is a desire to put this to its appropriate use. And that might be a use that requires doing it for some period of time or going through a process rather than immediate. Some people read Plato and think that there's an immediate negation of money that's going on, particularly if they just read the Republic, because in the Republic, he often will denigrate various people as mercenaries or people who do things just for money. But when he's doing that, he literally means just for money rather than money so that you can make something else happen.
But there is still this thing, right? Insofar as capital asserts its form of value, all other
Oh,
over all
yes.
other forms of value.
Yes, at that level, certainly. I've always, kind of juxtaposed the other end of the spectrum in political theory is Hobbes. And for Hobbes, everything that you do is motivated by fear of death. And that can be, what happens in capitalism and in commercial society is that we move from fear of physical death to fear of economic death, fear of poverty, fear of the failure of the business, fear of the collapse of the economy, economic death, as opposed to physical death. And the point will be made by the liberals that this is an advance. It's better to live in a world that's shaped by commercial competition and fear of commercial death than it is to live in a world that's shaped by security competition and the fear of physical death. Isn't this an improvement? Okay, yeah, it's an improvement. But we don't have to just think in terms of death all the time. That's how slaves think. And the purpose of philosophy is not to have us be better and better slaves.
Okay. All right. So as we kind of wind down now, I just want to read some of Slavoj's own words. We've kind of touched on some of this, but maybe it'll give you a chance to further elaborate on what you like or what you don't, or, points of disagreement. So on page 87, this is, I would say, one of the most important paragraphs in this section on Plato. Uh, Žižek says, we can now measure the true dimension of Plato's philosophical revolution, so radical that it was misinterpreted by Plato himself. Plato began by asserting the gap between the spatio-temporal order of reality and its eternal movement of generation and corruption, and, as opposed to that, and the eternal order of ideas, i.e., the notion that empirical reality can participate in an eternal idea, that an eternal idea can shine through it, appear in it, i.e., the individual material table in front of me participates in the idea of table. It is its copy. Where Plato got, so I think he's saying all of that is right. This is where he's going to say what he thinks Plato got wrong. Where Plato got it wrong is in his ontologization of ideas. He presumed that ideas form another more substantial and stable order of true reality than our ordinary material reality, What Plato was not ready, or rather able, to accept was the thoroughly virtual, immaterial, or rather insubstantial, evental status of ideas. Ideas are something that momentarily appear on the surface of things. Thoughts?
Yeah. So I want to say it's a little stronger. It's emanation, not just copy. Of course, there is a mimetic element to emanation. So there is a sense in which there is mimesis going on, but also emanation at the same time. So not only is the table a copy of the idea, but it also emanates from the idea and therefore contains the idea in its falseness. So it is truly the idea, but also it's false because it's emanating from. So it departs from, but carries it with. Uh, the later part, this is something I think is just very common on the left, which is to treat the stories that are told that have a kind of metaphysical valence as if they're supposed to be literally true, or as if they are something that Plato straightforwardly affirms. Uh, the thing is, if you take seriously the idea that all of our concepts are emanations, then all of our stories and narratives and analogies and all of the language that's deployed in the dialogues are emanations that to some degree are for use, are already departed from the thing. And this is why he writes in dialogues as opposed to the treatises and lectures and that you get with Aristotle. Because part of the point is that it is not the case that the text should be simply treated as true. Words can never be true in Platonism. There is always a need to be suspicious of words because words are always a departure from the thing so that you can use it. And that applies to every story and myth in Platonism, as far as I'm concerned. That's something that I think is really very frequently missed by people on the left, in part because people on the left have a suspicion, understandably, of theology, in part because of the conditions arising out of the struggle with the Catholic Church, struggles with Christianity, struggles with Aristotelianism in its various codified forms and in its various forms of merger with Stoicism. All sorts of legitimate reasons to be suspicious of theology. But Plato is not simply positing that these words are reality or correspond to reality or reside in a real place. All of that is just language. Any kind of metaphysical story is just signs, which emanate from the principle. And the principle is not straightforwardly grabbable. Anything you say to try to approach it is just more attempts to grab it with words. And this is why there's substantial reasons in the Platonic corpus even to worry about whether you should write anything down ever. Should you ever write anything down? Should you talk? Should people talk? This is itself something that Platonists and monks often really get exercised about, because even to talk is to potentially invite mistakes. And there will sometimes be moments where I go, I can try to say something more, but to try to say something more will probably just make it worse. And I have this kind of moment in a lot of arguments with people, where I'll go, shoot, I'm in a situation where anything I say will just make it worse. They're demanding that I say something, but if I submit to this, it can only make it worse. And then I have to kind of say, no, part of what you have to do to be able to hold on to this is to refuse to keep saying what it is or to go into additional detail, because this is to try to satisfy an impulse which fundamentally conflicts with it, which is this impulse to cataphatically say what it is. Platonism is too apophatic ultimately for that. It operates too much in a negative mode. But there's always a desire for Platonism to be this, and also to suggest that this was invented by modernity, the possibility of operating in the negative mode, that nobody else ever did that, that this is something modern people came up with.
So I think there is a point, though, where you and Slavoj are more on the same page than you are with others. So this whole discussion, I haven't brought in the alternate terminology, but the question of universals, which Platonic forms or ideas are the great example of universals, but in the history of philosophy, we have the ongoing struggle or debate between realism and nominalism. And realism says that universals are real in some way, shape, or form, whereas nominalism says no, they're not. they're just abstractions generated by us naming particular objects that have certain characteristics in common. And so I would just say that despite these differences between you and Slavoj, I think there's still a healthy defense of the universal with you two,
Yes.
opposed to nominalism. And so I would like to just hear your thoughts on, some of the typical nominalist talking points or points of contention.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to really argue with William of Ockham, because you can take this attitude. When you start talking about what should you regard as real, it's very difficult to argue with positions about that. Because what should you regard as real? What should you take seriously? And what does it mean? What are the consequences of not taking something seriously? Sometimes people say you shouldn't take something seriously, but they don't think through what that would imply in terms of behavior. If you actually don't take something seriously, that means you can't love it. You would treat it as fake. Well, what would you care about if everything is not something to be taken seriously? There's a kind of nihilistic outcome that comes about if you think like that. Now, people can say, well, you're arguing that nihilism is bad, but that presupposes that we take the difference between good and bad seriously. Yeah, it does. I can't really get out of that. If you know are cool with being a nihilist and treating everything really ironically all the time, and that's just what you want to
Which
do,
is not
I can't
Nance, I
really.
should just say. That's
Right,
not,
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm not. I'm saying you. But
I
like
know
if
you're
a
not. I'm just
person,
for the
right?
viewer.
Yeah, yeah, and for me, ironism is the great symptom of things having gone horribly wrong. The ironism that afflicts post-modernity. This is the symptom of people being unable to take anything seriously because they've decided that nothing ought to be regarded as real. And of course, part of the reason why people react against the subject and against cogito is that it involves only I am to be taken seriously and nothing else. And that is, of course, a ridiculous position to have. But nonetheless, people with that position have been able to do incredible things operating with that. So, because people have been able to do incredible things operating that way, that position is going to keep going until it demonstrably doesn't work, uh, or until it's transformed into something else through a process of immanent critique. Maybe we're getting to a point where that position demonstrably doesn't work or can be transformed into something else through a process of immanent critique. I think that a lot of the Christian atheism stuff is also an attempt to kind of overcome it from within itself. It kind of treats the post evangelical subject as the necessary point. In a similar kind of thing, treat that subject, even if the subject is mistaken, as embodying a form of subjectivity that's become necessary at this stage of modernity. And people who don't have this subjectivity might be more correct in the sense that they're less alienated, but we're getting more alienated over time. So the most alienated person is the person who is the necessary subject for the future. And sometimes I think about this in terms of the digital subject, the really atomized digital subject who is not very sociable and can't engage in politics very well. This is the subject who is the most alienated and who expresses the most contemporary of capitalist and modern conditions. So this hyper-atomized subject, which is railed against all the time by people as not being compatible with their social and political organizing, that just might be the subject that becomes necessary at this stage of capitalism, which means you have to be able to deal with the fact that that's where that is. And even if you want to make your way back to the good, you're going to have to do it in some way, dealing with the fact that that is the position that we've been brought to. And this is where I think there's a lot of overlap in what I think and what Žižek thinks here. If you make the point that what Žižek is saying applies to a particular moment in modernity and a particular constellation in which a certain type of subject or a certain way of thinking about what we are has been necessitated by events and has to be worked through and can't simply be reacted against or discarded. And then I would be the ultra left person in saying that we can go there maybe a little faster, or we can think there maybe a little bit sooner. Maybe we don't have to go all the way through the subject. Maybe we don't have to be Hegelian about it. Maybe there's a possibility of kind of coming back to Plato and using this to short circuit this process. This is the ultra left part of me. And that's why I think being a Platonist today is more left wing than being Hegelian.
Bold claim.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. This is exactly what I was hoping it would be. I guess I have one more passage I would want to read with you just to get your take on, and then Nance, whatever you're thinking, you can close us out. But I was almost going to skip this, but I'm like, no, let me read it. So this is from the last paragraph in the section on Plato, and this is where Zizek's becoming a very Hegelian Platonist in how he's defending the idea, because this is similar to the Hegelian move against Kant, that really there is no thing in itself. The thing in itself is just the limit of appearances. It's generated via the limit of appearance. And in a way, he's going to do a similar thing of saying that the idea is just in certain appearances, right? Or the absolute is in certain appearances. So he says, and again, here's the point. He wants to actually defend appearance as the moment where the Platonic ideal can be encountered, which seems to cut. Oh yeah, yeah.
Stuff that points is what I was doing. There's stuff that points at the principle and can kind of direct you or push you toward it. And an event is something very strongly that points.
Okay.
Yeah, because it forces you to change your conceptualization. So it forces you to, it gives you direction.
Okay, so he says, appearance and actuality are here no longer opposed. Precisely in trusting appearances, a loving person sees the other the way she effectively is, and loves her for her very foibles, not despite them. With regard to this point, the Oriental notion of the absolute void slash subject slash, or I'm sorry, void slash substance slash ground beneath the fragile, deceptive appearances that constitute our reality is to be opposed to the notion that it is the ordinary reality that is hard, inert, and there. And it is the absolute that is thoroughly fragile and fleeting. That is to say, what is the absolute? Something that appears to us in fleeting experiences, say, through the gentle smile of a beautiful woman, or even through the warm, caring smile of a person who otherwise may seem ugly and rude. In such miraculous but extremely fragile moments, another dimension transpires through our reality. As such, the absolute is easily corroded. It all too easily slips through our fingers and must be treated as carefully as a butterfly. In short, the absolute is a pure event, something that just occurs. It disappears before it even fully appears. And of course, by absolute he means the idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that there's stuff that points at it, but of course it never simply appears in being. But there are moments where you feel like you've seen it because there's something that points. And then you have to figure out, shit, this thing pointed. Why did it point? Right? Or if it's not something that pointed, sometimes you have a moment where you hit a wall. You go, oh shoot, I thought I was going toward it, but something has happened which has disrupted this motion. And now I have to deal with the fact that this occurred. So I wouldn't say that you actually see it. And this is the part of the tendency with Hegelians is to want to say that you can actually grab it. And this is, I think, a little bit of latent Cartesianism, which is to want to say that you can grab it, and then also to project onto Platonists the idea that you can grab it. Okay. But you can never grab it in Platonism because there's no way to actually be in the one in a totalizing sense. You can emanate from it, but you can't actually be and have identity with it because it's beyond being.
Okay. Well, then I think we've reached this point of fundamental antagonism or contradiction between you and Slavoj on the status of ideas. And yet, like I say, both of you are defenders of the idea. And I think that's an important thing you both have in common. Nance, closing thoughts?
I mean, I can't help but think, thinking the idea or the event, also thinking the encounter, um, thinking the act, um, and these things are always, um, at least in my thought, and when I think with them and try to operationalize them, it's always a failure to live up to something outside yourself, greater than yourself in a way that isn't predicated on greatness, but like really something, a surplus or an excess, that you are nevertheless some small part of. Um, and yeah, I mean, I really do think you're the way you're able to explain Plato, Benjamin. I genuinely have not heard anyone else, um, talk about Plato in a way that makes me want to care about it, makes me want to take it seriously. um, and again, I mean, that's probably the modern subject in me, the tendency towards solipsism, this ironism that's kind of a symptom of, oh, it doesn't really matter. I can just laugh, and the nihilism inherent in the moment. But I do see the necessity of working through that. Um, I think my biggest fear with Platonism, and theology and all that stuff is that there's always a telos in, that maybe I impute it, that there's always a for the sake of which, and maybe that's not the case with the one. Maybe thinking the one is simply trying to think the thing that we cannot think.
That's great.
Yeah, that's something Aristotle, shoves down everybody's throats, that everybody's got one specific essential role and function, and you're narrowed to it. And but the Platonic one is something you can return to and then come back away from again over and over, and you have to. You have to be constantly moving toward it and then away from it again so that you can act. So it's not something that you simply have to go to and then be inert in it, because you can't ever get to it anyway. So you can't ever be inert. You can't be inert.
Okay, Benjamin. We did this last time, but let's do it again. Tell people about what just happened.
Yes, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, which is my second book. It's finally out in paperback. You can get it for $24.99 USD. You can get it for under 20 Great British pounds. There's an ebook version of it that I think you can get for less than $15. It's the cheapest anything I've ever published with an academic press has ever been.
Everybody get you a copy of Studebaker's
Go to
first affordable
go to
book.
yeah.
Paperback.
It's is it on Kindle, the ebook version?
I think so. I know it's on Amazon. You could definitely get it on Amazon. You can also get it at the Edinburgh University Press website, which is, I'm sure, what they would prefer.
Yeah.
But I don't care how you get it. Just get it however is convenient for you.
Like I say, guys, for us, Benjamin is just one of the only political theorists and analysts that we want to hear what he has to say. Most of the time, I think people make these careers off of just having takes. They're not well versed in political philosophy. They haven't put in the time. And I think, we hold you in a very high regard when it comes to not just philosophy, but also thinking through the geopolitical situation. And on that note, also tell people about your Substack and your most recent article.
Oh yeah, my most recent Substack is called The Ladder of Castration, and it's about the basket of deplorables concept. Who did Hillary Clinton put in the basket of deplorables? The people who themselves had baskets of deplorables, people who blamed inferior scapegoats for the problems in society or problems in their own lives, the racists, the sexists, the phobes of various kinds. And how did people respond to the basket of deplorables? They created a basket of deplorables for people who make baskets of deplorables for people who make baskets of deplorables. They treated as an inferior scapegoat the PMC and the symbolic capitalists. And there's a possibility of doing it again, of getting upset with those people and treating them as inferior scapegoats and fancying yourself to be an Aristos and going, it's those bourgeois intellectuals in their inferiority who are unable to deal with the professionals, who are then unable to deal with the proletariat, who then scapegoat the lumpen proletariat. And you can do this over and over and over again. But the way out is political despair. It's to recognize that all of these social units have lost their capacity to do things in modernity and under capitalism, and scapegoating various social units and blaming them is not going to change this situation at all.
But Benjamin, isn't Asmongold right? And if we could just do something about the bottom 2%, the rest of our lives would be awesome.
Gosh.
I mean, that's the first order basket of deplorables. So we go up to first order, second order, third order, and then fourth order. And Hillary Clinton condemned the first order, and in the process created the second order. Then the people who condemned the PMC created the third order, and then there's a temptation to create the fourth order.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for
Hold
doing
on.
this.
Hold on.
Guys, I have an idea for a sequel conversation. I got to pitch it to Benjamin at some point, but I have an idea I think a lot of you will like if Benjamin is down for it. So stay tuned, more to come. And Nance, what were you going to say?
I wanted to bring up Tucker and MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's news with them, but I actually think that would better suit a different conversation, a following conversation. But yeah, Tucker and Marjorie Taylor Greene just like publicly announced we're done with the Republicans. So I think they're going to go start a third or even a fourth party if you take the alternative left idea seriously. But I wonder about what that means. I wonder if Tucker has the pull to pull enough people away from the traditional two-party system.
We need to talk to you again soon because I want to talk to you
Yeah.
about this stuff and geopolitical stuff like I mean, what's happened with Trump and the Iranians and everything this week have been wild. So there's a lot of stuff on that front we'd like to pick your brain on. So maybe we can do that sometime soon.
Definitely. I always love coming on and talking to you guys. It's always great questions, great conversation, fun stuff.
Awesome. All right, guys, we did it. Have a good night.
All right.